Yes.
The leaf bring armed self its regards.
Hello, everyone. I'm the Enforcer, and I'm accompanied by Enforcer Matt.
And good evening, folks. It's Enforcer Matt, and welcome back to day 1060 of the War News stream. And today we have very disturbing news that apparently Germany is warning of a possible Russian attack on NATO. Also, South Korea has descended into chaos, and also an Israeli attack on Iranian nuclear sites is likely imminent in the coming weeks. And it's good to see you all once again.
And of course, we're going to be covering the past 24 hours of news from around the world, as we have been able to hear today that a general inside of the German armed forces, also called the Bundeswehr, and specifically this German general from the here, has announced that the Russian Federation, according to German intelligence, is building up armed forces in significant number, far beyond the capacity needed for the Ukraine war, and is urgently warning NATO allies that it appears that the Russian Federation is preparing for an imminent conflict with the Western world due to the amount of force acquisitions that have been made by the Russian Federation in recent times. We have been able to see that NATO forces are already making small preparations for what may be coming in the future, as around to the area of Rezhal, a large amount of air defenses have been seen around this vital NATO air corridor, which continues to supply Ukraine with arms and weaponry to continue to fight the Russian Federation inside of Ukraine. Meanwhile, we've also been able to hear that in the Russian Federation, the Ingles fuel depot appears to have finally stopped burning. The damage fairly significant, and it does seem that several tanks have been completely destroyed within the blaze that lasted nearly 11 days. Meanwhile, we've also been able to see that the Russian Federation is taking significant losses in the Kursk Oblast, although they are once again using fiber optic drones to somewhat higher levels of efficiency than other times seen in the war. We've also been able to see that Ukrainian armed forces have been holding the Russian Federation at bay, inflicting significant losses onto a crippled and dying army of a crippled and dying nation for the large part in its final death throes. We have also been able to see that outside the war in Ukraine, the state of Israel is now preparing for a preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear research and development facilities here in the near future. We are hearing that the trade winds within the Middle East have shifted, and it appears that the United States will be backing and supporting hostile actions by the West against our adversaries in the region, attempting to drive them to their knees and completely rehabilitate any forms of nuclear weapons programs that are being seen inside the Islamic Republic at this time. It has been stated that the United States may take an active role in these future attacks by the State of Israel, either conducting additional fire support within those missions, or will, by default, for the large part, be assisting the Israelis in preparing their plan and helping to disseminate information and intelligence to them to make sure that their strikes are as effective as possible. The Iranians have also continued to show the underground facilities near to Bandar Abbas, which they claim will ensure that the Iranian Navy is impregnable while at port, although it appears that that is no longer the case at this point, as additional information came out today. Meanwhile, inside the Republic of Korea, mass civil unrest has begun as the civil proceedings against Yoon for the declaration of martial law last year have now begun. We have been able to see that Yoon supporters are actively tearing apart courts within the city of Seoul, and we've been able to see that the police have been mobilized by city authorities and the National Assembly to deal with the rioters and to quell their civil unrest or to largely disperse the crowds. But we have a major amount of news to cover today from practically all directions around the world, really all three corners of the world that we've begun to cover at this point. But of course, the most significant amount of news that we are hearing at this time is coming from a general within the German Bundeswehr, and it appears that the Germans are warning that war is coming. According to a statement that we've been able to hear today from Major General Christian Fruding, he has stated that Germany warns that Russia is amassing forces that exceed the requirements of the current conflict in Ukraine, and he warns that Russia is creating conditions for an attack on NATO in the coming years. Of course, many will know that the Ukrainian state has dealt a significant blow to the Russian military's offensive and defensive capabilities, wiping out a large amount of armored vehicles as well as a decent amount of artillery at this point in the war. In fact, Onyx, which is still compiling statistics on the Russian Federation's visually confirmed losses, has confirmed that 20,000 individual vehicles have been lost by the Federation up to this date, including around 3,200 main battle tanks, which is a significant portion of the existing Russian main battle tank fleet that existed on paper in pre-war figures. The Russian Federation is still, however, in a very desperate situation, and one that doesn't really allow them the fortune of being able to have a perfect military or perfect wartime conditions to be able to possibly spring an attack on the West. At this moment, the Russian Federation's economy is dying. This has been known for some time now, and it has been a somewhat slower process than expected, but recently, telltale signs are beginning to show that the Russian Federation's economic systems can no longer handle the strain, including the attempt by the Russian Central Bank to seize all assets in value over $13,300 from Russian citizens' internal bank accounts and savings accounts in the Russian Federation, to continue to issue loans to major Russian companies and the Russian government to be able to keep the war running. We have also been able to hear that 2 out of the 3 major real estate developers in the Russian Federation have declared bankruptcy in the past few months, and also some major oil and gas companies, including Lukoil Gas, have also declared bankruptcy and gone under as well, causing already significant ripples within the Russian economy. But these ripples are only expected to grow far larger as time continues to progress, and the considerable strain on the Russian economy currently will continue to really compound as time continues to pass. The Russian Federation is given an option at this point. They can either try to eventually get into peace negotiations in Ukraine, or they can escalate the conflict further, possibly to the brink of nuclear war, and then try and see if the West would concede and give concessions in the face of nuclear annihilation that would destroy both sides. It appears, according to the German general that we heard from today in Berlin, the Russian Federation is going with the latter, not the former. It appears that the Russian Federation is actively building up a force sizable enough in strength that not only could they conduct offensive actions inside of Ukraine, or at least continue the meat grinder that they have going on right now, but they could possibly expand and open new fronts against NATO itself within the area of the Baltic states or around the Suwalki Gap near to Kaliningrad in the Belarusian border. This would also line up with intelligence that we have received in prior days, as we have been able to see that Belarusian armed forces near to a supposed training ground at the city of Grodno have started to construct trenches only 6 kilometers away from the Lithuanian border within this direction. This would generally be a sign that the Belarusian forces may be preparing preemptive defensive positions, so that way if NATO was to put them on the back foot immediately if this conventional war was to begin, they would already have pre-prepared defensive positions to fall back to and attempt a defense of Grodno from a western advance, attempting to crush any Belarusian army group that may be within that area. However, it is one thing to note that we have been hearing, at least within recent weeks and months, but this has been largely not mentioned on this channel as it didn't really have any significance until now, that there is a large number of Russian military forces that are in Kaliningrad. In fact, it's actually a shocking number, at least according to the last report that I saw around 5 days ago. It is estimated that at this point in time, there is approximately 350 to 500,000 Russian military personnel that are within the Kaliningrad Oblast at this time. That is
Holy moly, I didn't know that. When did that news come out? Because I haven't seen that myself.
That's actually been floated around for quite some time. According to Western sources on satellite and picture evidence, the amount of equipment and personnel that appear to be present in Kaliningrad is roughly somewhere in between 350,000 to 500,000 in size, and it has been since the latter point of 2023. It's just that now with the news being told by the Germans that it appears that they're building up sizable forces focused towards NATO directly instead of Ukraine, this number now starts to become critically important, as around 350,000 to 500,000 ground troops being inside the Kaliningrad Oblast does pose a significant threat to the Suwalki Gap, which is NATO's supply corridor for the large part in the advent of a major war, into the Baltic states, and our direct front line that will exist 50 miles away from the outskirts of St. Petersburg, the second largest city in the Russian Federation. This is something that could end up becoming quite serious, and it does appear that, at least according to German intelligence right now within the Bundeswehr, they are once again trying to raise the alarm to the entirety of NATO that it appears that the Russian Federation is preparing for an actual war-like scenario. And once again, reminding everyone that the United States is moving forward at this point, since the Russians are already going to be turning down any kind of an attempt at a peace negotiation in spring, showing that they're not willing to really peace talk their way out of the whole situation and possibly concede something. They're now going with the alternative of trying to escalate this war out of Ukraine directly towards the West, whether we are trying to make that the case or not here in America, and then try and force us to look down the barrel of the nuclear gun and choose the annihilation of the Northern Hemisphere for the large part, or some sort of concessions towards the Russian Federation. In a sort, this is largely nuclear terrorism being conducted by the Russian Federation at this point, and the conventional army is pretty much the engine that will get them to that point. And to really quickly explain the possible Russian strategy that would be employed here, the conventional army does not stand a chance. Even with 350,000 to 500,000 soldiers inside of Kaliningrad, their offensive abilities would be short-lived and largely fleeting. The Russian Federation would not be able to break out into the Baltic Sea and actually control a naval corridor to supply the large amount of Russian forces that are inside of Kaliningrad at this time. The Russian Baltic Fleet does not possess the firepower nor the ability to be able to face down any NATO forces that would be within the Baltic, at least in terms of naval power, nor would they also be able to face down simultaneously the anti-ship batteries on shore in Sweden, the Baltic states, Poland, and also Finland, nor would they also be able to handle the large amount of air power that would be leveraged against them by the entirety of the European segment of the NATO alliance alone, firing anti-ship missiles at any vessels that would attempt to leave Königsberg and try and race out into the area of the Baltic Sea. Actually, it's not the Königsberg, it's actually Kronstadt, sorry, correction there, but nevertheless, they would not be able to break out into the Baltic and be able to create a supply corridor by sea to continue to support the offensive forces inside of Kaliningrad, meaning that this large bulk number would largely start to fade off in offensive capabilities fairly quickly. NATO would be able to blockade them practically immediately from getting any form of resupply from the Russian Federation. They would be able to create most likely a breach and a closure of the Suwalki Gap in the outbreak of a conventional war with that kind of manpower number behind them. They would be able to overwhelm Polish and Lithuanian defenders alone in the opening days of that conflict with sheer manpower and firepower initially. But as supplies would dwindle, these forces would become far less capable in combat ability, and for this reason, NATO would most likely be able to leverage sea operations as well as air-to-ground operations by our combined air forces to be able to close the land corridor that the Russians would create through the Suwalki Gap, largely once again closing off the Kaliningrad forces from any form of a resupply and then forcing them into largely a defensive position or a retreat back into Kaliningrad, where they would once again be closed off and the Suwalki Gap will be reopened for NATO forces and our supply corridors moving further on into the Baltic. This is something that once again is showing, however, that while the Russian Federation, most likely in any kind of a conventional sense, would be defeated on the battlefield, there is a far greater enemy in the background that exists, at least on the diplomatic negotiating stance, that the Russian Federation would be attempting to leverage. Once NATO forces began to defeat the Russian Federation's armed forces on the field and push them back into Belarus and also into Kaliningrad, and most likely would start to drive a spearhead offensive towards St. Petersburg, the Russian Federation would begin to state that the Western world, specifically NATO and the United States, are directly threatening the existential existence of the Russian state, which, according to their nuclear defensive doctrines, would be the justification necessary to be able to fire tactical nuclear weapons at NATO army groups on the battlefield. Once tactical nuclear weapons are used on the battlefield, we are largely expecting the negotiations would completely fall apart at that point and would never return back to any kind of a semblance of an attempt at making peace, meaning that at that point, once the first tactical nuclear weapon drops on NATO forces within this area, it would pretty much be inevitable at that point that weeks from that point, or that time, strategic nuclear weapons would be launched by the Russian Federation and the United States and the United Kingdom and France at each other, largely leveling everything within the Northern Hemisphere. That is the general fear that the Russian Federation wants to create if a conventional war was to break out, because it's either that the West decides that we will destroy the Russian Federation at all costs at that point, or they are hoping that through possibly the creation of a conventional war, they will be able to achieve some sort of major concessions inside of Ukraine, because the West would want to avoid nuclear Armageddon and the destruction of practically everything within the Northern Hemisphere. That seems to be the best logical answer I could come up with right now as to why the Russian Federation would be wanting to conduct some sort of a conventional war against NATO, or even start preparing to take that measure at some point in the future. But still, a lot of people have been saying that there's a little bit of an interesting deal going on with this, and something that a lot of people have been saying about what's going on inside of Kaliningrad at this point, and what's going on with what this German minister stated just a second ago. As Germany has warned that Russia is amassing large numbers of troops and may attack NATO, and a lot of people have been putting in their thoughts on this, and a load of people, there's two different beliefs right now. They're pretty much tied with what people are thinking. Either Russia is preparing for some sort of deterrence in a negotiating standpoint, or they are actually preparing for an attack on NATO to try and conduct some form of a short-term conventional war. They couldn't win the long-term conventional war, and that eventually would get them to the point of threatening nuclear weapons in a realistic scenario, which would force the West into major concessions to avoid a nuclear conflict. And so, Matthew, what are people thinking about this, and what are you thinking about it as well?
All right, so there's almost two even camps here, like you said. About 40% of the audience said Russia is preparing for deterrence reasons, while 38% said Russia is preparing for a NATO attack, and 9% said it sounds like a misunderstanding. And this is no misunderstanding. This came straight from a German general. He said that Russia's amassing way too many troops than what's needed to actually fight inside of Ukraine. And that does indicate that Russia is either trying to intimidate the United States, or they're planning on actually attacking a NATO member. So right now, that's the question we do not have answered. So my speculation on the matter would probably be that they're doing this primarily for deterrence. And if they get to the point where they're actually desperate enough, they might actually launch this attack. Not because it's the logical thing to do, but instead Putin may think, I'm backed into a corner, I'm about to be destroyed anyway, let me try to take them down with me. That could be the logic behind it, because otherwise it would make no sense, because Russia is going to lose that fight unless they're willing to whip out nuclear weapons. So I'm not really sure what they're thinking here, but the amount of troops in Kaliningrad, and also this general posturing on mainland Russia toward NATO, and also Belarus digging these trenches on the Lithuanian border, these are bad signs that Russia is preparing for war. And once again, these are the signs we've been worrying and hoping were not going to pop up, but it looks like they're popping up one by one. So I'm with the 40%. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would have to say that it is a fairly decent tie at this point as to what the Russian Federation is trying to do. They may be trying to build up these forces, and I see some people asking, well, what about the North Koreans? I mean, they were out of manpower to the point they had to get North Koreans. And that is true. They are out of manpower in the Ukraine war, to the point that North Korean troops are filling in some areas of the Russian Federation's armed forces or front lines inside the Kursk Oblast. But at the same time, though, I always pointed out in the day that didn't really make a lot of sense, because the North Koreans are largely sending these forces to Russia, not because Russia is completely deficient on manpower entirely, but more so that way they can use their own people as a form of currency, so that way they can get something in exchange in return from the Russian Federation. And usually that's some sort of food imports or some sort of weapons technology that would benefit the North Korean state in the long run. These troops are even lauded, the North Korean troops at least in Kursk, as completely combat ineffective by the Russians themselves, and there's been a major push to withdraw them from frontline action and to put them into more rear-line support roles, considering that they're not at all adept or prepared for the rigors or reality of a modern conflict. The Russian Federation, however, has been using these troops to, largely, I would assume at this point, take away Russian frontline fighting units that have had combat experience to possibly move them somewhere towards Kaliningrad, or maybe into a basing somewhere around the Leningrad military district within the north. Many people will also remember, and this is a fairly interesting thing as well, piecing all of this together with the information that we're hearing tonight, that the Russian Federation has created a new military district map that is completely different than ones that we saw in the past. And let me go see if I can pull up this military district map for all of y'all, because there is a new military district that has been created recently that would help with prioritizing specific instances and warlike scenarios within the northern region of Russia. And let me go and get this right here. This is the current Russian military district map. And there has been a massive change in this, at least in recent times. There was a restructuring of Russian military districts at least a little while ago from this, which was their original military district layout, which it was incredibly complex. Around the time of 2016, in the middle of the military reforms, they reformed the districts into a new shape. And these were the 4 military districts that existed inside of the Russian Federation. There was the Central Military District, the Western Military District that existed in this area. This encompassed Moscow and St. Petersburg, and largely the entire major population center of the Russian Federation. There was the Southern Military District, which currently is actually the one responsible for conducting the war in Ukraine. There was the Central Military District, and then there was the Eastern Military District. Recently, we saw that after the military reforms were supposed to streamline the war itself and how the war was being conducted, we then saw that the Russian Federation redrew the military districts during the middle of the war last year to then recreate the Leningrad military district based around St. Petersburg. This is a fairly significant thing when we speak on a strategic level, because it's showing that they're trying to create a brand new kind of a military district, particularly to deal with Baltic border security. The Central Military District largely deals with surge forcing at this point, meaning that Russia's most elite troops would be based within the Central Military District, or the Moscow Military District as it's called, and then move to other military districts as necessary, either under the command of the Southern Military District for the war in Ukraine, or in a hypothetical scenario with the West, there would be surge forcing of elite combat troops from the Moscow Military District to the Leningrad Military District to deal with the situation on the Baltic borders and also the borders of Finland, considering that that now recently became a member of NATO. That kind of action is once again showing us, at least hypothetically due to the restructuring of Russian armed forces in the middle of the war, that they are seriously considering some sort of a doctrine or a strategy to where they may engage in a limited short-term conventional war with the West. They would not be able to engage in a protracted long-term war at this point due to a complete lack of equipment. And it's also another interesting thing, though, I want to point this out, that Kaliningrad is a part of the Leningrad military district. So this military district would be responsible of pretty much every single element of the Russian Federation that would fight NATO in a hypothetical war scenario. Every single border that Russia has with a NATO country at this point is touching the Leningrad military district. And so it is showing us that that district must have been made back in 2024 because the Russian Federation was already wargaming out a scenario to where they would force a larger conventional war with NATO to try and eventually get to the negotiating table and get serious concessions, because the United States and the rest of the Western world would want to avoid a nuclear war. And Putin would largely be using the madman strategy, because what madman would ever try to fight the West knowing that they would lose? He must be crazy enough that that he would use nuclear weapons. And under that kind of a philosophy, the West may be much more likely to give in to major concessions in Ukraine because they would be wanting to avoid Madman Putin and the nuclear war that could result if they continue to keep the conventional war rolling and decisively defeat the Russian Federation on the battlefield. That would largely
or do you think if Putin decided to launch an attack on NATO countries, let's say he's getting really far back into a deeper corner like he is right now, and the economy starts going really sideways, even worse than it is literally right this second, and he decides to launch a ground invasion of, let's say, Estonia, Latvia, or one of these countries right here near the Baltics, then what would he be basically going for at that point? To take the country over and, do a ground invasion while simultaneously threatening to nuke the West if they intervene? What would be the strategy behind it? Because, of course, Article 5 would be invoked pretty quickly, I'd imagine, to defend those countries. So what would be the game plan, do you think?
The game plan would not be to take any territory from NATO countries. The game plan would be to use the war with NATO to get major concessions in Ukraine, because the Russians would tie it all together diplomatically to where it will be one scenario. The Russian Federation, at some point in this hypothetical scenario, is going to find something that would cross the line in their statements. And we've already seen that they've been trying to prep that kind of a statement for years at this point, really since the beginning of the war. Sanctions against Russia is just flat out war from the West. Supplying weapons to Ukraine, it's paramount to direct war with the West, and so on and so forth. They've been doing this for a while, but what they're going to do here in the near future, if they're trying to really go down this crazy path that this German major general stated today, is that one of these things they're going to say has crossed the line, and it is a full-on conventional war, a defensive war, they'll explain, from Russia against NATO. And with that justification, they will start a war pretty much largely within the Baltics, most likely, to try and threaten the direct heart of NATO in Poland and Germany. Finland would...
but also at the same time, though, if Putin launched a ground invasion into like Estonia or Latvia or any of these countries near the Baltics, would NATO stay pretty much relegated to defending within those territories, or would they probably take offensive actions into Russia, like mainland Russia itself? Because it would seem like if Article 5 was invoked to defend those territories, then NATO would probably be very wise to actually start striking Moscow, because that means they've gone rogue at that point. And giving into concessions while they're literally using nuclear terrorism to get their way, that would not be a good strategy to go down that road. That would lead to a worse can of worms, just a year or two after the war ended.
I would agree. It would not end up well. And NATO forces would, to make this a little bit clear, would most likely start to conduct counterattacks and start driving the Russians back. Once they stabilize the defensive situation, they would start to work on a counteroffensive, and those counteroffensives would most likely break the Russian forces. Because once again, let's all put this together, because now that this German general is saying this is something that is starting to make a lot of sense. We did just cover a little while ago that reservists were being called up for military training, and it seems that the German lieutenant general, major general statements today are backing up the idea that these conscript forces are being trained to regular army standards, possibly to try and build up Russian manpower or surge it or somewhat mobilize it for a short-term war with the West. So with this in mind, what they're going to do is that they're going to move these conscripts in large numbers into this area. And once again, I have to remind everyone, the Russians most likely already understand that a long-term protracted war with the West will always end in a Russian defeat. So the plan isn't to actually beat the West in some sort of a long, drawn-out war. It's to create a war. Whether they're winning or losing is not the point. It's to create a war so that way when they start to lose, which they eventually will, and NATO forces might push into Russia, they can start to justify the use of nuclear weapons on the West, and then they go, oh, we're going to do it. If you don't try and get to the negotiating table and end this thing now, more so on our terms than y'all's, we're going to start doing it. And then that's going to force NATO to go, look, this guy is crazy. He started a war with NATO, and it made no damn sense. They knew that they were going to lose. They're losing right now, and now he's threatening nuclear weapons. If he went to war with NATO, it's highly possible he could use nuclear weapons, so let's start negotiating. That is most likely...
Oh, geez, man. If it went down that path right there, I know that they might be backed into a corner. I'm speaking about NATO. They may be backed into a hypothetical corner to negotiate their way out of it, to avoid mutual destruction. But if we did that and took the easy way out and simply gave Putin what he wanted to appease him, so that way he didn't kill all of us, that would lead to such a bad can of worms down the road. That would mean, for example, if China wanted to take Taiwan, they would use the same nuclear tactic to intimidate everybody, take it, and then literally threaten realistically to nuclear bomb foreign countries to get their way. And then you might see Iran start doing that when they eventually get their nuclear weapon. That would be, honestly, that's a tough situation. That's a catch-22. That's the situation you don't want to have to be trying to decide in a nuclear world like this. And I think that's what MAD was actually designed to prevent, was getting to that point, was make sure that we have mutually assured destruction. So I don't know if appeasement's a good way to go on that one. That could be risky.
That could be very risky. This is the situation that I think everyone in the diplomacy world is dying over right now, because anyone with any basic level of analysis, and there's a lot of people who are way better at this than Matthew and me, are seeing this coming down the pipeline at this point, from what this major general said today in Germany, and are going, there's no way to win this one. Because we either try and conduct a policy of appeasement at that point once the war starts with the Russians, which means that now we're starting to lay out a precedent that nuclear blackmail does work, or we face them down literally to the point of possibly destroying the entire northern hemisphere to make a point. And we could end up all getting killed in a nuclear exchange or not at that point, but still, we have to make the choice. Are we all possibly going to get everyone killed in the northern hemisphere over this? Or are we going to give major concessions and just pray that things don't spiral to turn out to be worse? And it could end up becoming a lot worse if we end up conducting a policy of appeasement, and it could end up a lot worse if we face them down and do not relent, and we actually start to beat the Russians on the battlefield and push them back into Russia. Either way, this is largely a lose-lose for everyone involved if the Russians go through with this. Because who's to say that the Russians don't end up becoming a victim of nuclear blackmail from the Chinese later on down the road? Who's to say that that would not happen? And it could certainly happen. So this is something that I don't really think there is a good answer to at this point. Either one, you're dealing with a very tough end result. And once again, I do have to remind everyone that a strategic nuclear exchange, which is what the Russians will be trying to work their way towards, will end up killing most everyone in the northern hemisphere. When the nuclear weapons fall, well, when the nukes fall, most people would not be killed instantly. Well, actually, a lot would, at least numerically speaking. 30% of people would be killed practically within the first week of the nuclear bombs falling. Within the first year, it is expected that 2/3 of everyone living in the northern hemisphere in any country that had been attacked by a nuclear weapon would most likely be dead at that point. So that is what the Russians are trying to invoke the fear of, is thinking that everyone in the northern hemisphere, most everyone at least, would end up getting killed in this nuclear exchange. And so,
And also, another consideration as well. Like, I know some people are probably thinking, well, this would make it imperative, since Putin would resort to nuclear blackmail, this makes it imperative to reach a peace deal at all costs inside of Ukraine, so that way we don't actually have to get to the point of making that decision of whether or not we allow Putin to use nuclear blackmail and get away with it. So the catch with that would be, for example, let's say we go to the negotiating table inside of Ukraine and we say, okay, Putin, you can have as much of the Ukrainian territories you want that you've taken so far. You can have Crimea, you can have everything. And also, Ukraine won't get into NATO. You get everything you want. Let's end it there. The reality is, Putin is still going to reinvade Ukraine in a year or two after that agreement's reached. So it's going to happen again, and you're going to be right back in the same scenario unless Putin is deposed. And then if you try to depose Putin by tearing the economy down, that backs him into a corner, and that might trigger him to do something crazy and then attack NATO. So this is a tricky one right here. Like, I think the objective was not to get to this point, but a series of foreign policy decisions have sort of led us to this point, and now we're in a bit of a catch-22. All hope is not lost, by the way, but it's just a little bit tricky, and hopefully we'll be navigating this as appropriately as possible. It's very risky, and we're literally on a tightrope right now. If you fall off, we might all die. So, hopefully they got this under control, whoever's making those decisions.
And once again, we really have to lean heavily onto the U.S. nuclear doctrine, which is MAD, mutually assured destruction, to where we guarantee that pretty much, and one thing that is interesting, I do want to point this out, is that the numbers for the Russian Federation in particular are incredibly grim compared to those of the United States. The United States is an urbanized country. Most people live within a city compared to the rural countryside. But nevertheless, we have a more numerous volume of cities, and our cities are also less dense in population figures and are generally spread out over a wider area. In the event of a nuclear conflict, the United States would end up seeing approximately, and we're not speaking about the overall number of 2/3 of everyone in the northern hemisphere would be dead within a year. We're speaking about the particulars of the United States. The number would actually be a little bit smaller than the average. It would be around 50% of every citizen inside the United States would be dead within the first year. And most of them would survive through the second year, meaning that out of the 360 million people in this country right now, approximately 155 million of them would live through the nuclear apocalypse for the large part. So actually a somewhat significant amount compared to what a lot of people in pop culture would like to make you believe. The numbers are much more grim in Russia. It is assumed that around 70% of everyone in the Russian Federation would be killed within the first year after the bombs fell, because their country is a lot more urbanized than ours is, because of the largely the Soviet strategy during the Cold War, which was heavily urbanizing and building every single industrial center possible within major areas. So a city like Moscow, crazily enough, actually holds a whopping 10% of the entire Russian population. If you nuke Moscow, 10% of the entire Russian Federation's population is wiped out for the large part in a single mass nuclear strike. No similar thing can be done in the United States. Even hitting New York City, which has around 7 million people in it, and if we were to assume that a nuclear weapon wiped out all 7 million people, that is still only around 2% or a little bit less than 2% of the entire U.S. population, to kind of give you all an idea of how dangerous a nuclear war really would be for the survival of the Russian citizenry, not the state, but largely the citizenry. So the numbers would be whoppingly higher for the amount of people who would end up dying in year one in the Russian Federation than it would be in the United States. The great equalizer, however, is the whole of Europe, which would most likely get nuked in this exchange by the Russian Federation. The area of Europe is generally far more population dense than you would ever see inside the United States. It's fairly normal around the rest of the world to have population dense centers. So in the area of Europe, the numbers would be fairly high and somewhat similar to the Russians, somewhere around the mean or the average of about 60% to 65% of everyone in Europe would be dead by the first year. So that is why the number globally is around 2/3 of the world's population. Well, largely 2/3 of everyone in the northern hemisphere would be dead within the first year, but it is different from country to country depending on certain elements. But nevertheless, that is what the Russians are trying to invoke the fear of. But the Russians also do not understand what they may be going up against here in the future. They may see that the West does not flinch, and then we force it back on them. Is the Russian Federation going to launch nuclear weapons and see that 70% of everyone in the Russian Federation is dead within that first year? Or are they going to go to the negotiating table and actually negotiate under reasonable terms, ensure a white peace or a status quo antebellum treaty with NATO, returning the borders as to what they were beforehand and also withdrawing NATO forces out of Russia? Or would they start to try and conduct a nuclear war with the West, which would largely see the Russians losing that conflict by the end of it when the last bomb fell versus the United States in terms of those who would survive? And I saw Seth Francis say, this is very morbid, but this is the reality of the situation we're dealing with. This is not, we don't have the luxury of living in a time like World War II anymore. The times of World War II died in August of 1945 when the United States dropped 2 atomic bombs on Japan. From that point forward, war changed. War is not the be-all, end-all of world global conflicts or different kinds of fights or issues that arise between nations. The nuclear weapon is the ultimate decider of war. And with the nuclear weaponry, no country that is of a major significant size with nuclear weapons can ever truly win a war against another major power. It is almost always going to be assured that both sides will lose because both sides will deploy strategic nuclear weapons by the end of that conflict. Because one will be losing, they refuse to lose, so they will nuke the other, and in return, the other country will nuke them right back, largely ensuring that no one will win. So with this in mind, what this German major general is saying, he's not just saying that a war could begin on the face of Europe against NATO and Russia. He is saying that down the pipe, the Russians are going to start threatening nuclear conflict. And that is what is incredibly concerning about this. And this is what we have to understand. The Russian Federation is now going to attempt to move towards showing, Matthew, that the blend in between your plan and my plan may actually result in the Russian Federation getting to the point that they may actually possibly use nuclear weapons against Ukraine or start a conventional war with NATO. Either way...
Well, that's That's one of the risks of it. That's what I mentioned before. I said one of the risks is that you push Putin so far into a corner is that he lashes out. But the catch is, hopefully, this is the like bright side of things, folks. Because I see people saying, "Oh, this is like a doomer talk and things like that." No, it's not over. This is the reality of the situation. It is kind of ugly, but at the same time, though, hopefully, if this plan is implemented properly, which it sounds like the next admin is implementing the same plan that me and the enforcer were talking about. Hopefully, the people in Russia will rise up and say something and hopefully do something to depose Putin before it gets to that point. And also, if it got to the point of him like considering launching nuclear weapons, that might be the trigger for some of the military people to think now's the time, if ever, to stand up and get Putin out of here. Otherwise, he's going to kill us all, and we're not willing to go to the grave over Putin's ideas because it's one man pushing the war forward, and that's it. Literally, Russia's entire cabinet, Putin's entire cabinet, that is scared of Putin. They're all terrified. They know that in a moment's notice, they could be thrown out of a window if they say one single thing to disagree with this war. And Putin is the one at the helm, and I think that his favor is starting to run out with people. And also, the fear starts getting overridden when they start thinking about wiping out the entire country with nukes. That sort of gets rid of the fear just from Putin himself, what he's inflicting on his own MOD. They start thinking, we better act and do something, or otherwise he's going to get us all killed. So it starts becoming a sort of a good versus bad situation. They have to make a decision.
And it's going to be something where we're hopefully going to see that the Russians make the right decision, but that's kind of the risk at this point that we're going to have to play. But one thing I will say is that if the Russian Federation believes that they're going to conduct nuclear blackmail against the West to try and see that they get a policy of appeasement pushed forward inside of Ukraine, I would say that that is a absolute non sequitur. I would say that that's a hard no, because that is going to lay out a precedent from there on forward that the Western sphere can simply be defeated by threatening nuclear blackmail and getting to the point of actually using a nuclear weapon. That is going to show that that is the case. I would rather say that we should reach the point that a nuclear war might actually happen than try and avoid it completely. Otherwise, we are going to be laying out a precedent that will see the collapse of the Western sphere over the next few decades and the rise of dictatorships like the Russian Federation and China, largely controlling the majority of people living around the world due to their influence that they were able to gain through threatening the West time and time again with nuclear weaponry, and the West time and time again backing down completely. We cannot back off. This is an incredibly dangerous and a very morbid kind of a situation, but in this hypothetical situation, I believe that we have to have the same kind of resolve and commitment that we've had in the past during the Cuban Missile Crisis and during the Operation Able Archer training exercises of 1985, that we will not back down. We cannot back down. If we do, it will be the death of the West slowly. If we stand up and show ourselves to be a strong, unified sphere, we might end up being nuked. There's always a possibility of that. But there also might be a possibility that the Russians are bluffing and that they will back off and they will go to the negotiating table. Either way, we have to make sure that if this is going to be our final hour, then this needs to be our finest hour. And so with that, I hope that addresses this major piece of news fairly well, at least on that final note. But moving on into some other news to speak of other major things that have been going on today beyond the German major general statements, we have been able to see some very interesting stuff going on around Rezhal, as we have seen that there is a large amount of preparations that have been made around the Rezhal International Airport by a large amount of different air defense batteries and air defense contingents around the Rezhal Airport, including this NASAMS battery deployed by the Norwegian Armed Forces today. There is a significant amount of air defense that is currently based around the airport at Rezhal. These NASAMS are only a small part of it, provided, of course, by the Norwegians, but there is an American Patriot air defense battery that is also stationed near to the Rezhal Airport as well. At this point in time, Rezhal may actually be one of the best defended areas of Europe in terms of air defense at this moment. And we also have some additional pictures right here of the Norwegian Armed Forces and the NASAMS operational behind them. We can also see them setting up the NASAMS as well and getting them ready to operate. And we can also see the small contingent of Norwegian support vehicles that is a part of this NASAMS battery. All in all, a pretty interesting little deal, and once again showing us that NATO is taking quiet measures in the background to make sure that if something was to kick off, and if the Russians were to try and attack NATO, at least our most vital logistical hubs within the area at this point would be well protected from any kind of a preemptive airstrike. But moving on from that and out of that area, we were also able to see inside of the Russian Federation. Well, actually, really quickly, we're going to hold off on that news for just a brief moment. We're going to move on down into the Middle East because there's also been some major news coming out of the area down here today showing that Israel is preparing to finally act out on the preemptive actions and the preemptive strikes that have been talked about for an incredibly long amount of time against the Islamic Republic of Iran. These attacks against Islamic Republic's nuclear and research facilities has been talked about for around a half year at this point, and Israel is apparently moving incredibly far forward, according to Al Arabia, towards making these strikes a reality. Senior European officials believe that Israel has decided to launch an attack on Iran's nuclear facilities following the inauguration of a new U.S. president, and of course that inauguration will be happening, I believe, tomorrow. With discussions being had, isn't it happening tomorrow, Matthew, or is it Monday?
No, I think it's Monday.
Okay, it's Monday, sorry. With discussions being had between the president's administration and Israel on such an operation. It seems as though the United States, according to public statements that we've been able to hear, with the changing of leadership that will be happening on Monday, is already starting to move towards a far more hostile, directly hostile stance towards the Islamic Republic of Iran and their proxy forces that exist within the region. However, that has been delayed and has had some difficulties being believed in the public, as we have been able to see that a very lopsided peace treaty has been signed in between Hamas and Israel, to where around 30 hostages are to be released by Hamas, and the Israelis in exchange are to give back several hundred Hamas fighters, as well as a large amount of fuel and food support that will be transported into the Gaza Strip and will be hijacked by Hamas to allow them to continue operations within the Gaza Strip and once again rebuild their power and authority within the Strip. This is a peace treaty that has been heavily criticized on many other news sources, including this channel, but nevertheless, it does still seem that major hostile actions against the Islamic Republic of Iran itself are still underway. And we have been able to hear that there has been some very fiery rhetoric coming out of the United States, Israel, and Iran all towards each other. And it does appear that the Islamic Republic of Iran may finally be seeing that their nuclear research and development sites are targeted in full by an Israeli-U.S. attack in the future. We do not know if that attack will ever happen, but it does sound that it is seriously being considered at this point within diplomatic circles inside of the Israeli government and the U.S. government, and maybe a form of appeasement to the Israelis, considering that we've already heard that there's been major upheaval within the Israeli government due to the terms of the peace treaty that was agreed to with Hamas. And this may be a way to assure them that while Hamas, in the meantime, may appear to have won out in the end, the Iranians, which are Hamas's main provider of arms and finances to be able to continue their operations within the Gaza Strip, may cease to exist in any threatening way for the foreseeable future. The Iranians have been trying to prepare for actions that may be conducted by Israel and the United States, and have been preparing some underground bunkers throughout the country for the Air Force, the Navy, and the military as well, because the Iranians always know that it's best to live under a rock when dealing with America, because, if you sit there and actively watch what the United States is doing, it might scare you. So living under a rock underground is a fairly good thing for the Iranians, because it keeps them blind and unknowing of what the United States really is capable of. But we were able to hear that this secret bunker apparently sucks. Also, I want you all to hear this guy at the beginning who sounds like he's talking in a warehouse, like in Amazon. Like you can hear like metal clanging around in the background and stuff, like they're fulfilling Amazon orders or something in the background as this guy is talking. But I also want to show y'all Iran's new fishing boat fleet. You see, these are vessels, I want to make this very clear, of the Islamic Republic of Iran's Navy. This is actually crazy to think, because these are on trailers like large fishing boats. So,
it looks like some type of speedboat or something you take out like for a good weekend, like if you were like a billionaire or something.
But it's equipped with a dishka, therefore it is a naval vessel. So the firepower is extreme, man. Imagine the damage that they could inflict on the high seas with a dishka. I mean, it's got to be incredible. But let's take a look at
what
this.
What are they fishing for, man? They're fishing like a redneck. They got the gun out and they're shooting the fish.
Man, they're gonna sit there and go, "Hell, boy, I think I see a school of fish." It's like, it's like they just start laying into them. But beyond that, I do want to address this really quickly to explain why this bunker sucks. The Iranians lauded, before they showed this bunker, that it was going to be able to house the larger vessels of the Iranian Navy, pretty much in a sense like a submarine pen. There are submarine pens around the world that are built into the sides of rocky cliffs, very deep inside of these cliff sides. So that way, normal munitions and ordnances wouldn't be able to directly attack the submarines and destroy them while they're inside of the submarine pens. Such submarine pens have been built and have existed really since World War II, with the Germans really leaning into heavily the use of submarine pens. There are still some that exist in some areas because the concrete that they were built with was so thick there was no way to destroy them. And you can actually see some of those right around here. If I really quickly come down here, this is one of the submarine pens. And let me see if I can show y'all this building right here. Here it is. We actually tried to blow these things up and demolish them, but the concrete they're built out of is just simply so thick it's impossible to demolish these things. So it remains an existent reminder of Nazi control or Nazi occupation of France from 1940 to 1944, still to this day in Saint-Nazaire. But you can see the submarine pens in their entirety. They still exist. And the Russian Federation, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and many others, I believe the United States, in some rare instances, also employ the use of submarine pens to be able to protect their submarines while they're at port. The Iranians claimed, however, that not only are they going to have submarine pens, much like this one, but they're also, crazily enough, going to have pretty much ship pens. Something similar to a submarine pen like I'm showing y'all right here, but it would be able to house the larger frigates of the Iranian Navy and protect them from another Operation Praying Mantis-like strike and stop the United States from being able to completely cripple the Iranian Navy within about less than half an hour. However, with footage coming out of this compound, that's markedly untrue. These compounds and tunnels appear to be fairly small in scale, only able to house the speedboat-like patrol boats that the Iranians have, and not larger surface vessels. So the tunnels suck in the larger sense, but let's take a look at them. Also, I like the picture they have out right there. It's almost like they're already having a funeral. They're like, rest in peace, he will be gone by next week.
He was the best bass fisherman that Iran ever saw.
He was able to catch those carp, all those carp. But now they're giving us a hyper view of the tunnel and all of the speedboats that they piled into the thing. Also,
why would they pack the speedboats in the hallway? Why wouldn't they put it like in a room or something?
Due to budget cuts, they weren't able to build rooms. It's just a giant tunnel. So yeah, this is literally the thing. It's just a tunnel.
Yeah, it seems a little crowded in there. Like I don't think you can move one of those boats past one another. It's too tight.
You know something I just realized, Matthew? This thing is built to about the standard width of a subway tunnel. So they probably got one of those tunnel boring machines that you use for a subway and just started digging with it until they built this tunnel in its entirety. And then they were like, okay, let's put boats in it. And then that was the end of it. And that's what they have. But here's the little boats operating. By the way, don't be scared by these rockets. They're incredibly small. And we generally know that most of them are unguided. Most variants of them are largely unguided. And the ones that are guided, the U.S. Navy has been able to war game it out, and we can shoot these things down with relative ease. So no real concern to be had there.
Yeah, I don't think anybody was ever worried about the quote-unquote Iranian Navy. They shouldn't even really call it that. They should call it the Iranian, Fisher Group. Oh, look at this. They had something.
Look at them blowing up.
Is that the USS Cole?
No. Oh, look, they have an aircraft carrier. Holy moly. Look at that.
Where did they get that?
Oh my lord. Oh, and we can now see them. I like how they hate America, but they wear baseball caps. I always found that to be a weird juxtaposition of anti-Americanism. It's like, we hate America, death to America. But I love that baseball cap. I'm just going to have to nab that. But it's like, why do you do that? And also, I like
hot dogs too. I will say the only thing that I can give them credit for is they keep the place extremely neat. But that's about it. But it'll be real dirtied up whenever it gets hit, though.
Also, I've heard, Matthew, that this guy right here on the right is actually employing Iran's new body armor. It's called a pillow, and you stuff it under your shirt, and it helps to protect you from bullets. At least that's what it looks like he has.
Wishes that was a pillow.
Well, what is that? It's my gut. It's like that's not bulletproof. But we can see them walking past the boats. We can see a couple of them do have the anti-ship missile cells on board.
I don't know what's up with those really bad paintings of people in front of these boats, like you were just mentioning a moment ago. I don't know what even that's about. And these paintings are terrible. What was it done on Microsoft Paint?
I don't know, man. Maybe they're like martyrs of Iran or the commanders of these boats. I have no clue, but it's stupid. And here they go with another long, drawn-out drone view of the whole damn thing again.
I'm glad they're giving us a layout of the tunnel, though. This would be perfect for future strikes.
I'm telling you, man, I promise you that they built these tunnels with some sort of like a standard industrial tunnel boring machine because the width of them, it's literally like the London Underground or something like that with like how these tunnels are. Well, the London Underground has tiny, tiny tunnels, but it's almost like a U.S. subway tunnel. And let me go see if I can show y'all one U.S. subway tunnel because I want to show y'all this because it looks as though they used the same kind of tunnel boring systems to do it. So let's see here. This is an older picture. Actually, no, I will go with a more modern one. This is a modern picture of a New York City subway tunnel, one of the more modern ones that has been rebuilt over time. But beyond that, notice the width of it, and also note that it can fit an entire U.S.-sized standard subway through the corridor. This tunnel appears to be almost the same dimensions when you look at it. I mean, it's almost the same height and everything that a U.S. subway tunnel would be.
They probably just borrowed the equipment or something, because I'm sure that Iran didn't have a subway system before now.
They had to have gotten it for. Let's go see if Tehran has a metro. Tehran Metro. They do have a metro, so they have a tunnel boring machine. They probably repurposed the tunnel boring machines that built this subway system and brought them to southern Iran to build those tunnels. That's probably what they did, I would assume at least.
Yeah, probably so, I'd imagine. I'm sure they didn't just steal one off of something because they're massive. So yeah, they probably already had one.
Dang, man, they actually have a lot of stations in Tehran, and they also built a lot of tunnels. Look at the lengths of these things: 54 miles, 15 miles, 20, 15, 40. A total mileage in the subway system, by the way, of 182 miles of tunnels. So they certainly do have the tunnel boring equipment to be able to make something like that possible in the South. And without a doubt, that is why those tunnels exist. It is some sort of a commercial boring machine used for the subway system. And holy moly, Harvey the Drummer, thank you for the massive support and helping this channel to keep on running. But moving on from the Iranians, because we want to make sure to knock out our international news all in one fell swoop right now, we're going to be taking you all over to the Republic of...
We have a poll.
Yes, we do have a poll. We love the polls, and also I believe this poll right here is called let's see, Oreshik, which is a very interesting Polish name. But beyond that, sources claim that Israel will attack Iranian nuclear sites in a matter of weeks, and a lot of people are wondering if this is a good move or not. And I don't really think a lot of people are wondering. It almost seems like everyone's definite on this. Everyone is saying that this is a good time and a good moment to go ahead and push forward with destroying Iran's nuclear research and development capabilities before they can be used and deployed in a dangerous and threatening way. Others are saying, a very small group, that this is a bad time or a bad move. Others are saying that any time is bad, this just isn't good. And others are unsure and undecided. But Matthew, what are people thinking about this? And what are you thinking about it as well?
All right, so 73% of the audience said yes, this is a good move and a good time, while 7% said no, this is a bad time and a bad move, and 9% said any time is bad because this is not good at any point. And on this one, I would say that this is a long time overdue, and really, honestly, Israel should have attacked the nuclear sites the last time they launched an attack. And once again, the guy that leaked the plans, he's been caught, that rat within the CIA. He has been locked up, and he will probably be facing some pretty serious charges for that, so he will get his punishment. But Israel now has their chance to move on Iran and take these nuclear sites out. The only concern that I have, though, is you might remember the Iranian president just went to Moscow yesterday, and I'm sure that Iran's probably gotten word that Israel is about to attack their nuclear sites for real this time. It's not just a bluff, and it's also not going to be backed out of, most likely. And I'm not really sure why the Iranian president went to Moscow. It could have been maybe Russia was asking for help, or maybe Iran was asking for Russia's help, so that if their sites are attacked once again, then Russia might do something to attack the West, and Iran might attack the West in return as well. So I'm not really sure what that whole meeting was about, but that is a bit of a concerning point. But generally speaking, that shouldn't deter us. I think we should take the nuclear sites out, or otherwise Iran could be using that nuclear blackmail some years into the future, and we can't risk that. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would say that this is a great time and a good move. It is an aggressive move, and that's what it is designed to be. The Iranians will not produce a weapon of mass destruction in violation of non-nuclear proliferation treaties that all signers guaranteed would be adhered to if they had knowledge that a country was attempting to produce a nuclear weapon. We have knowledge that the Iranians are producing a nuclear weapon right now. We know that. We understand that. the intelligence is verified. The United States should actively take a role with Israel in striking and destroying these sites within the imminent future. Not only is that a move to ensure that the Iranians will not become a nuclear power, that is a direct message to the Russian Federation that the United States will have a spine and will go to the point of obliterating some fools, so that way we will ensure that the West remains on top. That may be a good way, using Iran pretty much as our punching bag, to show the Russians that if they try and attempt this stupid, ill-fated plan in Eastern Europe that the German Major General was speaking about, we might not back off, and we might not get to the negotiating table and attempt to make major concessions to them because we want to act like idiots. We might actually see that through to the finish, to the point that the Russian Federation sees about 70% of their people dead by the end of the first year. So I believe that that would be a fairly decent move to make against the Islamic Republic of Iran, and also would be a good message for the United States to send worldwide, is that any active partners of this sphere of the Axis powers at this point that we're seeing will not be able to succeed, and the U.S. will be directly involved in stamping these people out and ensuring that they will largely fail before their plans even come to fruition. That would be my assessment at the moment, and so I would say that this is a great move and a perfect time to do it. And so with that, we're now going to be moving on from the Middle East and over into the Republic of Korea. Many people may know the show Squid Game, a Netflix premiere series made for the Republic of Korea about a group of have-nots, as has been explained by the director, that are taken by a group of wealthy businessmen to conduct a series of childlike games, but the failure rate is the chance of death by the guards. But nevertheless, one other kind of drama has been made by the Republic of Korea recently that is starting to captivate the world beyond Squid Game, and that is the Yoon Suk-yeol chaos, or the Yoon Suk-yeol crisis that we're currently seeing devolving right now inside of the Republic of Korea. We saw that he declared martial law last year. The declaration was shot down by the National Assembly. The National Assembly then voted to impeach Yoon and successfully impeached him, now making him a former president of the Republic of Korea. The National Assembly then moved forward with prosecuting Yoon for attempting to overthrow the democratically elected government, and then moved forward to have him arrested. Yoon Suk-yeol then refused to be arrested and barricaded himself inside of the presidential mansion within this area right here, and attempted to stop law enforcement from making their way up there and actually apprehending and arresting Yoon Suk-yeol. However, the authorities under the National Assembly were finally successful, and he was brought to largely a court to be tried for his crimes that he conducted against the Republic of Korea while in the office of president. Today, we've been seeing that mass civil unrest, not masked, but mass civil unrest is now evolving inside of the Republic of Korea, and specifically within the capital of Seoul, as we have been able to see that clashes between the protesters and the police are occurring. I don't know what Pepe is doing up there, but here is the unrest.
Oh, damn.
Moving on from
This is
that,
almost like a comedy scene or something like that. You see that guy getting smacked with that green stick over there? Like, that guy was smacking the hell out of that police officer with that stick.
well, I don't know if you saw this, but do you also see that one of the protesters had a police shield with him? You know, like, he literally just nabbed a riot shield. Oh, gosh. Look at this. He's using it against the police. I mean, like, this is, like, crazy.
Also, look at that one person right there. You see that one person, like, leaned up against the police shield? That person's gotten stuck right in the middle of the crowd and the police, and it looks like they can't get free.
Yeah, it's a pretty horrendous kind of a situation. It's just absolute chaos right now outside of the court. We also got to see in other instances that some of them were able to make it into the court and then started tearing down the walls. I don't know what they had against the walls in particular, but they started to tear it down.
Huh. Tofu drug construction made in South Korea too, I guess.
I guess. I mean, you hit the wall and it literally shatters. It's not exactly a great sight. Maybe some building codes need to be revised. They also started busting out windows as well. And you can see that right here.
Look at that. And this was at the court?
This was at the court, apparently, that I believe Yoon Suk-yeol was at, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, wow.
So it was a little bit interesting to see that they were just literally tearing down the Civil Affairs Department and other places in the city of Seoul that have to do with the exacting of justice within the country, but it is certainly becoming a large situation. While we have seen that Yoon Suk-yeol finally surrendered himself to law enforcement inside of the country, it appears that there is a significant faction of the Republic of Korea's citizenry that actively supports Yoon Suk-yeol and his efforts to suspend the government. To quickly explain the situation to many, and a very neutral explainer of what happened to lead to this point, a couple of months ago, back towards the latter end of 2024, Yoon Suk-yeol, unannounced, declared martial law in the country and declared that the National Assembly had been suspended. The National Assembly is the South Korean form of the U.S. Congress and is elected by the constituents of the Republic of Korea, as well as the President of the Republic of Korea is also elected by the citizenry. And he attempted to suspend the rights and abilities of the National Assembly and governance, largely at that point making Yoon Suk-yeol the dictator of the country if that had been successful. This has been done in the past, and this is something that some people may not know. And this has actually been a justification in the past as well that he used now by many others, specifically Syngman Rhee and Park Chung-hee. Those are both former presidents, quote unquote, of the Republic of Korea, but they're largely understood today, and they are dictators by a modern sense. They largely installed themselves into power through a military coup, suspended elections, declared martial law, and suspended the National Assembly in both instances. In both instances, they stated that they were doing this because of the interference of some sort of a foreign power into their country's government, and they were attempting to stop this unholy influence that was being conducted by an external country. Usually they would say that it was the Communist Chinese, the North Koreans, or some other faction entirely like the Soviet Union. But in recent times, Yoon Suk-yeol made the statement that the Chinese were openly trying to subvert the government and create an insurrection in the country as its justification for the declaration of martial law. That was quite literally the exact same statement that was made by Park Chung-hee when he became the dictator back in the day, back in the early 60s. And Park Chung-hee remained the dictator of the Republic of Korea up until his deposition in 1979. And that was really the bringing forward of a couple of other dictators who were not as successful as Park Chung-hee in retaining power. And then the first democratic elections that truly happened in South Korea were held in 1989. But nevertheless, he used the same justifications that were used in the past. The National Assembly this time, however, actually has the backing of the citizenry, as democratic institutions have largely finally founded themselves as integral parts of civil society inside the Republic of Korea. And so for the first time that we've ever seen in South Korea's history, the military interest enough actually followed the orders of the already shut down National Assembly when they voted unanimously to order the military to stand down. This then allowed the National Assembly to begin an impeachment of Yoon Suk-yeol immediately, which they were able to succeed in and actually had him impeached, meaning that he is no longer the president of Korea at this point. Moving on from that, they are now trying to set an example that those people of the past in South Korea's history, like Syngman Rhee and Park Chung-hee, will not be able to succeed in creating a dictatorship in the modern-day Republic of Korea. And for this reason, they are now attempting to prosecute him to set an example that democratic institutions within these countries will not be overridden by a president with dictatorial ambitions. And so that is what we're seeing at this moment, is that they're following through with prosecuting Yoon Suk-yeol and imprisoning him for those actions. It seems as though there is a decent contingent in the public that is believing that the story that Yoon Suk-yeol put out, and they're trying to say that this National Assembly is run by the Chinese and is attempting to usurp the Western world and turn South Korea into North Korea or something along those lines. But that's what is largely going on in the Republic of Korea at this point. If anyone was really wanting to know what exactly was going on, that may sound like it was a little skewed, at least in terms of analysis, but that's because unlike others who largely look at this through a modern lens, where there's always people saying, like the Romanians, we're suspending elections because the Russians were poopy heads and we think they interfered in it. Looking through it through a historical lens, this is actually a fairly common thing that has happened in the Republic of Korea's history, where those presidents have said the exact same things and declared martial law and suspended the National Assembly under the exact same circumstances with really no explanation rather than that they were trying to maintain control. There also was an external element involved with what Yoon Suk-yeol was doing at this time, or more so what his wife was doing. According to what was going on before the declaration of martial law, his wife was actually being investigated for misappropriating party funds from his political party inside the Republic of Korea to purchase personal items such as expensive purses and clothes. They were being investigated for that, and it appeared that the investigation was also going to move into Yoon Suk-yeol, as he largely would have to be the one to give his wife access to the political party funds to be able to purchase these items with. And so it appeared that the investigation was going to move towards his direction, and he was going to go the way of many other former South Korean presidents since 1989 that largely had been imprisoned for corruption reasons. So it appeared that Yoon Suk-yeol was attempting to beat them out to the punch and declare martial law and suspend the National Assembly, making him the de facto leader of South Korea without any opposition, because he may end up possibly being imprisoned in the future for his possible political scandal with misappropriating political party funds. So that appears to be the entire story that we understand at the moment from everything put together. So there largely isn't really a reason to support Yoon Suk-yeol. And also some people are saying that the opposition in South Korea, which is not a part of Yoon Suk-yeol's party, is pro-Chinese. They're not pro-Chinese. They are advocating, however, that they should trade or open up larger trading relations with the Chinese, largely for South Korean exports, not imports. Also, by the way, I do have to explain that there will be limited imports from China, but under the current proposed trade regimen that the opposition is putting forward, they're largely looking to be able to sell South Korean products inside of China, helping to bolster the South Korean economy. So it's not exactly a Chinese takeover. It's more so that they're trying to expand their economic trading abilities and GDP growth through some sort of a trading arrangement. And it's really more so leaning towards the South Koreans than the Chinese. So that largely is the situation that we're seeing right now. But a lot of people are talking about South Korea descending into a state of civil unrest over this instance that's happening today and what will be happening in the future. And a lot of people are believing that the South Koreans will be able to get a handle on this and will be able to prosecute Yoon Suk-yeol successfully. Others are saying that South Korea isn't going to financially recover from this and that South Korea is going to turn into North Korea. Some other people are saying this just sounds like hype talk, and others are unsure and undecided. But Matthew, what are people thinking about this, and what are you thinking about it as well?
All right, so let's take a look. 59% of the audience said South Korea will get over this pretty soon, while 15% said South Korea is not going to recover, and 18% said it sounds like it's overhyped. And I will admit that this is not good for a healthy democracy to be going through things like this. But I think ultimately South Korea probably will get over this. It sounds like these are simply supporters of Yoon, and they're not really in huge numbers. Like it's a decent amount of people, but it's mainly just the people in front of the camera, if I'm being perfectly honest. So I think South Korea will be fine. Yoon probably will be held accountable, hopefully, because he should be held accountable for what he did. But I don't think it's going to be something that they can't recover from. So it's definitely not overhyped either, because clearly this is causing a bit of a ruckus, but I don't think it's as big as it's being made out to be. But Enforcer, what say you?
I would say I don't believe that this is going to be a horrific thing. They're going to end up prosecuting. This is most likely just a little bit of a bumpy spot. They'll probably prosecute him successfully and imprison him for a couple of years, just to set an example that those kinds of things will not be happening in a modern Korea anymore. And that largely will be what it is. It's a little interesting to watch right now, the spectacle that's going on, because usually a lot of people know that, a lot of people perceive that South Korea and Japan are largely free of any kind of political scandal or political intrigue, but that's actually quite the opposite. Japan and South Korea are filled with about as much political scandal as really any other Western country. It's actually sometimes even more interesting in Japan and South Korea, because sometimes some people will do crazy things to try and game the system to get a little bit of money out of it. One time in Japan, there was a guy elected in Osaka. I don't know if you've heard this story before, man, but he was elected in Osaka because he was the only candidate that ran. And so he ended up becoming famous and popular because he was the only guy that ended up running in this area, and he was representing the entire city of Osaka. And years later, they found out that he had been gaming the Japanese political system because the Japanese government pays for government officials transportation costs wherever they go. So every single day, he claimed, literally every day, that he took an 8-hour round-trip train ride from Osaka to Toyooka and then back, which means that he would have never been working. So someone finally caught on to that, and they were like, hey, wait a minute. he can't be taking the same train every day. Like there's no way that he could be doing this. They investigated it, and he had been lying about it. He had been writing into the Japanese government these stamps, pretty much, that were saying that he was taking this train every single day, and it was an expensive train, mind you, because the journey was so long round trip, and he had literally been making tons of money. I think at the end it was like $1.7 million over several years on fake train fares, and he was just raking in cash. I mean, it was the craziest thing.
Wow.
He got in prison for it, but those are the kinds of things of political intrigue and scandal that happen in Japan and South Korea. Just to give you all an example, because I have to say this. Unrightfully so, because I'm not saying that Japan and South Korea are not very well kept places, but unrightfully so, Japan and South Korea get a reputation in the Western world for being completely free of any kind of scandals at all, and that is wildly untrue. South Korea and Japan are riddled with scandals, just like the United States or any other democratic country is, because there's always going to be bad eggs in any of those kinds of systems, and you have to always be trying to root them out. But anyways, I hope that does address that well. Also, before we move on, I do want to say really quickly that I got to mention it. TikTok did just shut down when we went on air. I think it was right when we went live on air. TikTok actually shut down in the United States. So if you go in the TikTok app, it tells you that because of a U.S. law that's shutting down your free speech and completely eroding your First Amendment rights, that for some reason the CCP was really interested in protecting, you're no longer able to access TikTok and look at thirst traps and also other brain rot. So a very unfortunate
Yeah.
thing. I'm just kidding. It's actually great.
And also, let's translate it. Basically, it's they're saying that they're trying to protect your free speech. It's like no. China's basically saying we don't have the right to brainwash you anymore. So now we're upset and we're going to take the app away. So Also, it looks like CapCut went by the wayside as well. It's another editing software. It looks like that one also went offline as well. And now I'm seeing that apparently some other ones. Apparently, there's people in the government thinking about banning other ones like Temu, AliExpress, Tencent, and other apps, or not apps, but websites like that. So that could be huge if they start banning all those as well.
And I got to say a big shout out, at least at the moment, to the U.S. Congress for pushing that forward, to everyone who voted for that on all sides. It's great to know that the United States of America and the U.S. government is taking affirmative and assertive action to actually deal with foreign apps that are attempting to influence the American public discourse in a more extremist and communist form. Really great to see that, and it's good to know that we're finally taking some action against such apps that are being pushed forward by the Chinese Communist Party. But anyways, moving on from that, it is now time for us to get on into the question segment, because it's actually a little bit late on into the news. We've been covering the news for about an hour and 30 minutes straight now, and we still have a decent amount of combat footage to cover inside of Ukraine. And so with that, Matthew, what do we got?
All right, so our first super chat question of the night is going to go to Harvey the drummer, who's of course a longtime channel legend, and thank you very much, Harvey, for that support. He throws in a $200 donation, the largest one of the night, and huge shout out to you, Harvey, once again for that generous support. And they said, Happy New Year, boys, and Happy New Year to you, Harvey, and also it's good to see you once again on the